I wasn't sure if I was gonna do an introduction for this, but then I was like, yeah, it's probably good to just kind of introduce who I am and what I'm doing here. I'm gonna talk about Deltarune Chapter 1, and I kind of want to talk about the other chapters too, like in separate videos, but this is just like me talking, and if people like it, that's really cool. If you don't want to listen to me just talk about Deltarune, there will also be like video and stuff, actually keep you occupied if you don't want to listen to this in the background, but like I'm just gonna talk about Deltarune and a few other things, and if you guys like what I'm talking about, I really want to talk about stuff in the comments or on like Discord, so like you guys are very welcome to watch and discuss it with me. If not, this is just kind of like a personal journal of what I think of each chapter of Deltarune and what I feel like. This will not be like a summary of Deltarune Chapter 1, not really, like I will mention things that happen obviously, but I just want to talk about like very specific stuff, but I'm just gonna get into it because I love Deltarune. I love Deltarune so much. See you guys. So I did consider talking about the characters first, but there's also something else I want to talk about. There's like this bed in Chris's room, and you can sleep on every other playthrough. You can sleep and you can just skip the whole school part, get in the dark world. On your first playthrough, you can't skip it, which kind of makes sense. I kind of want to talk about like what this kind of means because it kind of really makes my gears turn, because you can more or less do this in every other chapter. Chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. You can skip probably like once you've played the chapter, each time you can just skip yourself to the dark world, which kind of makes sense, right? Each time there is a different amount of time that passes between these skips. In chapter 1, you skip everything up to like the first moment you're in the dark world. That's interesting. It kind of makes me think of a few theories. My first theory that I really like is the idea that no matter what Chris does, they will always end up in the dark world. No matter what we do, we will always end up with Chris in the dark world. Same with Susie. We do not know if going to sleep just kind of closes Chris's eyes, like we go to sleep but Chris still goes to school, or if Chris actually goes to sleep and for some reason they end up in the dark world. Same as always, each and every time Chris will end up in the dark world, same with Susie, and the same events will play out. This kind of gives like a few theories. One of my friends has this loop theory that Deltarune is an ongoing loop, and Chris, us, and whoever else, maybe Spamton or future characters, are trying to break this loop through the shadow crystals and other things. I really like that theory. I think it's cool because it would kind of explain why things will always repeat and exactly go this way. And I think this is what the actual ability to skip is supposed to tell us. These events will happen regardless of what we try and do to stop them. We do not have a choice until we do eventually break the game and give ourselves choices. I find that really interesting just because no matter what, you will always start in the beginning of the chapter 1 Dark World. You skip the classroom scene, you skip that stuff, but you will always experience the entirety of the dark world. And I don't really know what all of this means. There could also be stuff meant to be skipped. There must be some kind of correlation between the time that you skip and what the characters talk about or do. However, I haven't really figured that out yet, and I'd kind of have to go dig into it a little bit more. Part of the game, you can go back to sleep, but you will always end up in the dark world. You are meant to be there. And I referenced this before with Gaster knowing who you will meet on your journey through the special names you can input. Gaster knows this is how things will happen. He's not worried. He is not worried about anything because he already knows that you're gonna play as Chris, possibly. So yeah, I think this is really cool. It's one of my favorite things in the game, like this ability to skip and how much theory it actually gives you, how much like it makes you think of ideas. It's really cool. Now, the first character I want to talk about is Chris, because Chris is very near and dear to my heart. I love Chris. They're my monarch. They're non-binary, very important, since it's something a lot of the fan base can't really come to terms with. I love Chris, and I love most of the characters in this game, but Chris is very important. We kind of take Chris's life away from them, and we're kind of the villain in a way. We're not evil as the soul. I do want to talk about the soul after this, but you know, to Chris's eyes, we're probably the worst person in their life, unfortunately. And in chapter 1, we don't really see a lot of the soul and Chris dynamic. Neither do we necessarily see a lot of Chris, but a lot of what we learn about Chris is learned from other characters and what they know about Chris. You can talk to Rudy in the hospital, and he's like an uncle to Chris, sort of, and you know, calls them a weird kid. Some of the residents around the town, they just kind of poke fun at Chris, they make fun of them. They also make fun of Susie and a lot of the other characters, so a lot of people in this hometown are kind of rude, but you can kind of tell Chris is like a weird kid. They're a weird kid, awkward, just by themselves, wears baggy clothes. I mean, there's an interaction with Asgore where you arrive at the flower shop and Asgore immediately hugs Chris and talks about how he doesn't remember if Chris likes hugs. This is at the end of the chapter after you've already had the opportunity to make Chris hug the training dummy and Rousey, and you'll have more opportunities for this later. However, it is very important to note, this pretty much tells you Chris doesn't like physical touch, or, you know, something along those lines, which is very important. Characterization through someone else. And then you kind of start to think about stuff like, you made Chris hug somebody, either the training dummy, Rousey, or both. How does that kind of play into our relationship with Chris? They don't seem to be able to say no to things like that. However, they do seem to actually have some control over their movements. As we see in the fight against King at the end of chapter 1, they're able to leap to Susie's defense and take care of her with a shield. That is out of our control. We're not able to do that. We don't do that. That's a cutscene. Chris does that. So if Chris didn't want to hug somebody, would they be able to stop it? Well, that's the question. Chris probably just goes along with things. Again, a character trait that is not explicitly told to you. Chris just goes along with it. Even if they don't like it, even if they could stop it, they go along with it because this is probably something they knew was going to happen. Chris probably knew they were going to wake up soon. One day they're gonna wake up with the soul in them and they're gonna have to do its bidding, and that's very unfortunate. I feel really bad for this kid because they remind me of myself a lot. I was a weird, awkward kid. I still am very weird and awkward. I love Chris. They're the monarch. I love them. And there's a few other things to talk about, like how when you first play the game, again, the very first time you play the game, the save file, the first save file you find will have Chris's name on it, Chris save file, and we take that over, and that's, again, sad. Like, we're just taking over this kid's life, and they don't deserve that. They're probably a nice kid who just, you know, is just a awkward kid, teenager. There's also dialogue in the diner about how, you know, the only friend Chris ever really had was Azrael, their brother, and then Azrael went away, and now, you know, the family's also kind of broken. Asgore and Toriel don't seem on speaking terms, necessarily. I mean, they do kind of talk a little bit later on, but it's whatever, you know? Azrael was probably the only person Chris had after the family kind of began to split apart, and then Azrael's gone. We do see Chris being friendly, or other characters being friendly to Chris, namely Noelle. Berdley's somewhat friendly. Everybody else just is kind of rude to Chris, I'm not gonna lie, like, kind of a jerk. And then Susie and Chris seem to have never really interacted before, or at least just, you know, Chris doesn't talk to her, she doesn't talk to Chris. So that seems to be the case. This seems to be their first interaction. But as it is, Chris is just kind of a weird kid. They don't have friends, so since they don't really have friends, who would know better that they're being controlled by another worldly being like us? And nobody can help them, nobody can do anything. Chris just has to go along with everything, and that's really sad. We see more of Chris as the game goes on, but there's a lot to be said about Chris, especially in chapter 1. There's some other stuff in the later chapters. There's a lot of other stuff in the later chapters, but even in chapter 1, a lot of Chris is through the world. You find out about Chris through the characters. You find out about Chris, like, the places in hometown and specific reactions Chris may have, but generally Chris doesn't say much. Chris doesn't do much. Except for the end of the game, of the chapter, when Chris rips the soul out of their body and throws us into a cage. That really kind of shows something. There is determination enough in Chris to actually pull us out. That's very interesting. Chris clearly has determination, but I also think because we are the soul, we kind of take some of that determination away from Chris. And obviously when Chris doesn't have a soul inside of them, they're weak and they're not able to do very much. They very visibly limp, like they're weakened, so it kind of makes it obvious if you just pulled out your soul or heart. It's just, Chris is just a kid. A lot of these characters are just kids, and I think we should really feel bad for them, because I do see them as actual people. Whether or not you should do that, you know, I consider them actual people. They're just a bunch of teenagers trying to get through life with a little bit of escapism, and I think they could really use a older figure to actually look after them, but it seems nobody in hometown gives any care to the actual kids who are clearly going through stuff, and it's kind of just sad to see, as Chris is just kind of made fun of by a lot of the characters and just punched down at. It's kind of sad, but I think a lot of us were there at some point in our lives where you're just kind of an awkward kid. You don't really want to talk to anybody, and you don't really know how to speak to people, and you're just awkward. And so people just kind of make fun of that, and they don't really show any interest towards you, which is kind of sad. I think, you know, it's fine to be like that to a certain extent, but I also think people could try and like help you if you're like that. I got a lot of help from people when I was younger to try and be less Chris like, I suppose, but at the end of the day, I love Chris. Not a lot to say in chapter 1 necessarily, but there will be more stuff to say as we go on. But as of now, we just kind of take over Chris's life and make them do stuff that they probably don't want, and they don't seem that resentful towards us, probably because they know what's going on. So yeah, of course, want to talk about the soul as well, because like the soul is very important. We're the soul. I like to think that Gaster is just like, oh hey, you're scrolling TikTok or something, let me just get you into my game, let me get you into my world, and you can like look after these kids or something. Anyway, bye. It's very clear that at the start of the game there was a different idea that Gaster had for us to put us in a vessel, and then someone else placed this inside of Chris. Now, regardless of this, I think it's very important to kind of recognize our role as the soul. We're mainly meant to keep these kids safe. I mean, they have to deal with a lot of stuff outside of the Dark Worlds, but inside of the Dark Worlds, they have to fight these monsters and stuff. They already have to deal with a lot of stuff outside of the Dark Worlds, so the most we can do is make sure that they get through their adventures safe. There are certain things you can do as the soul, but you generally don't have a lot of choices about how the game progresses. You can choose to fight enemies or to spare them, which gives you somewhat of a different ending for each chapter, and also sort of changes the castle town a little bit in the future. However, talking about the castle town will happen as we progress through different chapters. I like the relationship Chris has with the soul as the game progresses. Right now in the beginning, we really didn't know much of what was going on, and we just kind of took things for granted. I mean, in Undertale, you don't really have a purpose as the soul. A lot of people just kind of play Undertale. I mean, I never played Undertale. I didn't have money to play it, and at the time Undertale came out, I was still playing on a PlayStation 3, but I was really happy to watch a lot of people play the game. And what a lot of people did when they played Undertale is they played as themselves. They probably self-inserted. They were like, oh, this is me, this little character here, this is me. Because Undertale makes way less of a distinction that you're the soul and you're separate from the person you're controlling. So it was really easy in Undertale to just kind of like self-insert yourself as the main character, which is fine. You can do that because we're really not told a lot about Chris. I think it's fine if you do that in Undertale, if you want to be like, oh yeah, this is me, because we're really not told a lot about the main character in that game. That's why it's so important when we come to Deltarune and we're given a character with a name, with history. It makes a very clear difference from Undertale to Deltarune that, oh, this game, being this heart, being the soul, is gonna mean so much more for what comes forward. And that's correct, it kinda does. A lot of characters in the game talk about your soul. They mention your ability. And some characters outright even know that you're not from this world. While I would like to bring this up in the Rousey section of the video, I do also want to bring this up here. Our first battle encounter where Rousey is present, the tutorial, he clearly mentions the soul. He is aware that the soul exists, and this is never brought up again, which really bothers me. a lot of stuff in Chapter 1 of Deltarune, very specifically, a lot of stuff in Chapter 1 is never really brought up again. There are very meta jokes that Ralsei makes about Lancer and the fact that he had a team full of support characters who didn't have genuine bullet patterns. We never see this again. Like, not really. Not that I'm aware of. This might change as I go take a look through the chapters again as I make these videos. But we never really see that mentioned again, and nobody really seems to react to it. Like, there is a very clear meta perspective that Deltarune has a lot over Undertale, where the soul and our presence is very impeccably mentioned. I can't even say that word, but I know it sounds smart. It is so important that this distinction is made in this game. And as we go on, the soul has more of a role, separate from Chris. The soul, us, it's very important that I keep saying us, me, you and I, me, myself, and I, because the soul is us. We're the soul, and we're a completely different character from Chris. And I think that's so interesting. I haven't seen that done in other games. Like, it is so interesting to make this obvious distinction that we're separate. And it creates for some very interesting ideas. If you wanted to self-insert yourself in the game, you could self-insert yourself as the soul and exist in Chris's mind, sort of like, if y'all have ever played like Borderlands, Tales from the Borderlands, that would be like my exact way to describe it. The same way that Handsome Jack exists in Reese's head, just like showing up around and just being able to like walk around and anything in a metaphysical sense, that works. I like that. And I like to think of the soul as that. You can think of the soul being like next to Chris in an actual body, but they could not be seen by anyone else. Like, it's a very interesting thing to be. You can also think of the soul as just like a heart with a mouth and some limbs. Like, there's a gif I really love on Discord where it's Chris fighting the soul and it's drawn over, I'm pretty sure it's like the fight scene from the Ted movie, and it is so funny to me. Like, I can't get enough of it. I just send it all the time, and it's funny. But I like to imagine the soul as that. Like, the soul's low-key just like two pairs of legs and hands. And it is funny. There is a lot you can do with the fact that the soul is separate from Chris and it is separate from this entire world. I believe it creates so much creativity if you're someone who's a fanfic writer, or you're an artist, or you're both of those things, or you just like to daydream and pretend you're friends with the characters, which is something I like to do. I'm a bit parasocial, and I like to imagine myself hanging out with the characters in Deltarune and a lot of other games, and those games I will also like to talk about on this YouTube channel. But generally, it's just kind of cool to have that distinction. You're separate. You're a separate entity, and you know that. You know that you're a separate entity, and that's cool. I think that's awesome. There's not much for me to say about the soul right now besides what I've already yapped about, but later on there will be a lot of really cool stuff that we can discuss about the soul as we get into later chapters. I say this a lot in this video, and I'll probably keep saying it as we get into later chapters, because in chapter 1, this is a lot of what we had. We just kind of had the chapter. It was setting a lot of stuff up, so a lot of the important things in the chapter didn't really get a lot of scenes. We were mainly focused on the dynamic of the trio. Now, this is kind of why I wanted to make the video in the first place. The Field of Hopes and Dreams. It's a very interesting song in my opinion. I really like it. I think it's one of the best songs in the game, to be fair. Like, out of all the chapters, there's like one other song I'd rate higher than the Field of Hopes and Dreams, and I can't really talk about it yet because it's later. And I kind of want to like talk about it in like full detail and just obsess over it when I get there. But it is a song from chapter 3 specifically, and you can probably guess what song that is if you've played chapter 3, but it is really good. But I really like the Field of Hopes and Dreams, and there's a lot of stuff I'd like to say about it. Like, first of all, why do we get told the name of the song when it comes up? Like, okay, I really like how the song is introduced. Like, you walk into the field and it's really quiet and you're not sure what to expect, and then you walk into it a little bit and it just stirs off. It's a banger. it is fire. It is like that gif of a guy like writing on a paper and it's like fire. That is the Field of Hopes and Dreams. But I find it really weird that it tells us the specific name of the song. And I think there is like a lot of importance in that. Of course, this never happens again, and it's like Toby Fox, whatever, thank you. But like I think it's actually done deliberately more than people pay attention to it for. There's obviously the fact that in the song you can kind of hear Don't Forget, at least in the beginning, which is like the song that plays in every credit scene of Deltarune. So I think that's really important because Don't Forget is obviously going to have a lot of importance later on, I feel like, and we're probably going to get like a full version of the song when the game is done, most likely, because we have like a little bit of the song, but it's really not the entirety of it. The reason I compare it to Don't Forget is because Don't Forget's an important song, but why is the Field of Hopes and Dreams also important enough that Toby clearly tells us the name of the song? Well, there's a few things that I kind of thought about that I think make it really cool. One of them is the fact that in Undertale, the last boss of the game is Azrael, and the music that plays is Hopes and Dreams. Really good track. Here's the thing, this is the Field of Hopes and Dreams. This is Deltarune, this happens after Undertale, and the way I kind of see it is, I like to think this is the very first, like, song we hear as we actually adventure, and it's supposed to kind of be Toby Fox telling us, oh hey, you're moving forward, you're moving past Undertale, like this is a new adventure, you're moving past through the Field of Hopes and Dreams, you're moving past that final part of Undertale, and you're going through Deltarune now, like you're grown up, you're older, I'm older, like Toby Fox speaking, he's older, he's more experienced, he knows what he's doing now, he wants to move past Undertale, he wants to let go of that, focus on the future, and now we're walking through the Field of Hopes and Dreams. A lot of people talk about how the song has like a nostalgic feeling to it. That might be because, you know, Chapter 1 was such a long time ago, it was like 7 years or something, it's gonna be like 8 years soon, which is crazy, right? But like, I think that has significance besides just it being a long time ago, because the entire world of Chapter 1 has a very nostalgic feeling to it. I mean, the entire world is a forest-like area that is made up of very old toys that kids used to play with. The Dark World in Chapter 1 really gives me the idea of like a pretend world the kids would come up with when they were younger, and they would use the toys to kind of do that. I mean, you have chess pieces, you have like playing cards and stuff like that. It's like a lot of stuff that like a kid can very easily make something with. Like, you know, you build like one of those castle of cards, card castle. Is that even what the like area in the game is called? Like card castle? I'm pretty sure. But like, yeah, you build a castle of cards, like you stack it. Everybody's done that at some point. And you play chess. Like everybody's played chess in their life. Everybody likes to play chess. And it's just like, I think the Chapter 1 Dark World, it just gives off, especially with the Field of Hopes and Dreams, it gives off such a nostalgic feeling of, wow, remember when you were younger and like everything could be exciting? Like, yeah, that's kind of what it reminds me of. Because, you know, even the characters, you know, they're all kind of sad, to be fair. Like Chris and Susie, they're pretty sad. Understandably so. There's a lot going on with them. There's a lot of baggage, and very clearly they don't have a lot of people to rely on, but that's probably something they enjoyed at one point in their life when they were younger, and they could just kind of go off into the world of their imagination. And that is also something to be talked about in terms of the dark worlds in this game. They are escapism. Multiple times in the game, like especially in later chapters, the dark worlds are regarded as like places to escape, places where, you know, even Rousey talks about like in later chapters, like in Chapter 2, a lot of this content that I'm talking about is like Chapter 2, but like Rousey talks about how, you know, the dark worlds are a place for Chris and Susie to come to rest, and I think there's a very fair idea, like, for a theory that is just like, all of this is just Chris and Susie playing pretend, or all of this is some very sad dream that Chris is having, or something like that. Like, there's always these theories about media like this, media that showcases like very, media that showcases very mistreated characters actually going on adventures and having a fun time. This kind of media will always have the idea in the back of it that it's like, it's all a dream, it's not real, or it's like regardless of whatever story it is, it will always have an element of, this is all fake, the kids are in a coma and they're gonna wake up and none of this would have happened. And there's merit to that. Like, there is merit to it because of how Rousey talks about how a lot of the dark world darkners talk about stuff. Like, they're very easy to just be friends with you if you don't hurt them. Like, that's something that, a kid would come up with. Like, I remember when I was a kid and I was like imagining myself hanging out with all of my favorite characters. I still do that, but not as much. But I mean, I'm still very like parasocial about that. Like, daydreaming and imagining myself like hanging out and being best friends with all of my favorite characters. Like, they would love me, wouldn't they? And then in that kind of way, you can kind of see what I'm getting to. Like, what if Chris is just like, oh look, these are my favorite characters, I'd like to pretend that I'm best friends with them and daydream about it. What if Susie's doing it? It's like, it's all a very deep, it all comes together in a way because you can interpret the story of Deltarune in a lot of ways, and I think to a certain extent you could even make this like a very fair headcanon for how you want to see Deltarune, because a lot of people have different ways of seeing Deltarune. Some people, like especially I have a friend and she's pretty awesome, she thinks that Deltarune is like a continuous loop, like the story repeating, this exact story repeating over and over again. And Chris is somewhat aware of that, which is why Chris is trying to get the shadow crystals. Because I didn't really mention this in the Chris part, because it's not really obvious in chapter 1, but as we go through the game, it is very obvious Chris wants the shadow crystals for something. There is a purpose that we do not yet know, but there is a reason that Chris wants the shadow crystals, which I think is really interesting. Like, you can see it as a whole loop that repeats until you can see the game as a loop that repeats until the moment it is broken, and I think there's a merit to that. Me personally, my personal like headcanon is every generation there's like a different group of prophecy adventurers, or fun gang. There's a different fun gang every generation, and I think that's a cool theory. I think that's a pretty great theory, especially talking about like what we've seen so far. That could definitely be true. Every new generation, there's people trying to open the dark worlds. Every new generation, and if there's people trying to cause the roaring to happen, there will always be a fun gang to stop it. Which kind of goes into my whole point about how Chris is always meant to be in the dark world. Which kind of goes into my point about Chris that I mentioned, which is how Chris will always have to be in the dark world, regardless of if they go to sleep or not. They will always end up in the dark world, and the story will always happen. There is no way from us to stop the story from happening. There is no way to stop the events. There is no way to do anything, because in reality, if you really think about it, there's no way for us to stop the events of the game from happening. The events must happen even if we try to stop them. And I think that's interesting as well. Like, it's a lot of stuff, but we're kind of getting into like theory territory, and we're kind of getting into like later chapter territories. I kind of want to talk about theories very separately from this video, because this video is just me kind of talking about my ideas. I do want to mention theories, but at the same time, talking about theories is just kind of a very big spiral. But keeping the field of hopes and dreams in mind, just like everything else, I think it's important. I think it will come up again later on in the game. We will return to the field of hopes and dreams, because there's something very important that I don't see a lot of people mention. It's the door in Castletown. The door you go through to go to the Field of Hopes and Dreams and go to Card Castle. The door closed when we went through that, and it says that the door may never open again. If you try and check it again, it may never open again. Now, I do not know what this could mean. The door may never open again. It seems like there's a way that it will open again at some point. But there's also a very interesting thing for me to say. Why is Castletown connected to the Field of Hopes and Dreams? Like, that's something that I don't see a lot of people mention. Why is it connected? I understand that the Castletown is in the locker room. Understandably so. Again, why is Castletown in the locker room specifically? We have never, seen the inside of the locker room. We do not know what it looks like on the inside of that locker room. We just know it's dark and it gets us to the Castletown. The Field of Hopes and Dreams is the classroom to the right of the locker. And if you kind of think about it in a way, the path you follow to actually go through the gate and enter the Field of Hopes and Dreams is kind of the same path you would follow to just go from the locker to the other classroom. So I kind of have an idea that we might have to go back there at some point. Why else would that door still be there after we completed Act 1? That door has significance. And the Field of Hopes and Dreams also has significance. It will come up again. That's why we know its name. We know the name of the song because it will be relevant in some way. This is not an oversight, I'd like to think. I could be going mental based on a very janky oversight of something Toby Fox was like, oh, this is gonna be cool to do, and then he just stopped doing it. I kind of get it that it could be that because a lot of stuff in chapter 1 is very different from later chapters. It's very obviously different, but this seems a little too deliberate. I can't think it would have been too hard to remove something like this if he didn't want it in the game anymore. But at the same time, fairly enough, why would we need to know the name of every song in the game? I mean, could you imagine every time a song played, like a new song played, we get that message? Do we really need that? No. But at the same time, there's something important. He could have just done it for area music and it would have been fine, but he specifically did it for the Field of Hopes and Dreams. It never really comes up again, but it is probably one of the most memorable songs in the game, and that means something. He clearly wants us to know this song. I just cannot figure out why. Besides the fact that it will be important later on in the game, and it will definitely have to be important again. It will definitely be used, and it might be in the very final chapter. It might be in chapter 5. Chapter 5 is not out yet, but I do think that the Field of Hopes and Dreams will be used at some point, and there's a lot of stuff that's gonna happen, okay? This is a very good song, and I think it will come back up. But while I'm talking about the Field of Hopes and Dreams, I do think I should kind of talk a little bit about like the rest of the Dark World, because there are some things I kind of want to talk about. I do think it would have been cool if the Field of Hopes and Dreams was just the general theme for the Dark World. I don't really like the song in the forest area, like it's whatever. There's, to talk about music in this Dark World, that you also have the Castletown music. However, I'd like to touch on that later on in chapter 2 most possibly, because I'd like to try and do like one song each chapter. So I'd like to touch on Castletown maybe next time. But there is one thing to be said about Castletown's music, and the fact that it just kind of gets dropped after chapter 2. And it is so unfortunate because I love the music in Castletown. I absolutely love it. I absolutely love Castletown. But there is one more song in this chapter that I really like, which is the Egg Room song. The Egg Room. I should really talk about the Egg Room, but I don't really need to because I feel like everybody talks about the Egg Room to death. And while it's very interesting, it's like, what more can I say? I think it's just some guy I do not think the egg rooms will have story relevance, unfortunately. Possibly something, but I think they will just be used as a way to signify something. I mean, they're eggs, Easter egg, right? Like, I'm not a total doomer. I am crazy for theories regarding, like, some of my favorite characters and stuff like that. But the egg rooms are so strange that I don't even know what to talk about, you know? Like, yeah, Easter eggs, very basic way of saying it, but I do not think that the eggs really have a significance in the events that will happen in the game. I would really like to be wrong because I like any kind of like really. I'd really like to be wrong because any creepy secret in a video game I think is amazing. But on top of this, I do not think the eggs are Gaster. I don't think it's Gaster. He doesn't sound like Gaster, nor does he sound like Papyrus. I do not think it is Papyrus. I think the Eggman will just be like, it could very well be another human. I think that would be very interesting. It could be Chris's therapist. That would be very interesting. The egg room is connected to something that happened to Chris, at least. And this is all kind of weird. Not much to say about Gaster and the egg and all of those things because I genuinely don't really find it that interesting of a mystery. I think it's cool, I think it's creepy, but the only way I'm gonna find it interesting is if it actually leads to something that we learn about Chris or that changes the game in some way. But it's really not a lot to say about the eggs in this chapter, especially because there's so little dialogue. Now, having kind of talked about the egg room, there's not really much else regarding the Dark World that I kind of want to talk about. I mean, I talked about Lancer. I kind of want to talk a little bit about Chaos King. I do think he will be relevant later on in the game, because we obviously don't get the choice to kill Chaos King. He is taken captive. There is definitely going to be something up with Chaos King. I would like him to go through some sort of redemption or some kind of moment where he protects the Lightners, but it is very clear that he will have relevance later on in the game. He is one of the only Darkener bosses that doesn't become our friend after we fight them, and I think that's interesting. I think that's cool. Queen and Tenna, they're obviously great, but Chaos King is interesting. There is something more to Chaos King. I really hope so. I hope he's not just a gag, because there is relevance, there is importance in Chaos King. And I'd really like to see Toby Fox do something with him because of this importance of him being in the cage, of him being there. I think there is a lot of importance with that. I don't really have a lot to say about Joel. Very cool character, introduced a very interesting side to the game with the shadow crystals, but out of all the characters, I think Jevil is unfortunately the most overlooked one, because part of the problem I kind of have with the shadow crystals, the shadow crystal bosses, is that they don't have a lot of relevance to the story. In their specific chapters, they obviously have a lot of importance. However, after their specific chapters, they're never really brought up again, which is kind of sad, because we bring a bunch of characters to Castletown that you may or may not really be interested in. However, I'm a bit disappointed that we don't get any interactions with, Jevil in the future. Jevil is never really brought up again. I would really like for them to be important, but understandably so. To make characters like these relevant, characters that are not really going to be found by a lot of people in their first playthrough, would kind of be a waste of time. I mean, most people are not gonna fight Jevil on their first time around. My first boss was Spamton in Chapter 2 because Jevil, I didn't realize you could go back into the elevator and go to the question mark floor. I didn't know that, so I just played Chapter 1, and eventually I was like, oh wait, you can go back into the elevator? Oh my god, there's a question mark area? Oh my god, it's Jevil. I had no idea about that. I did not know Jevil existed. So, in that sense, I would have played the rest of the game without knowing about Jevil. And if there was, well, I did play the game without Jevil the first time around. Like, I think, I think if I remember correctly, when I first played Chapter 2, I may have had like a save file without Jevil or something. I don't even remember, to be fair, but regardless of whether I did have Jevil or not, nothing really changed. But it is important to know that, like, if I didn't have Jevil, I would not have seen any content that Toby Fox would have put in if you were to include Jevil just like he includes Queen Antenna, because you're going to have Queen Antenna regardless in your castle town or in your adventures. Even if, well, you can give Tenna away eventually, so that's like whatever. And you have Chaos King as well. Like, you are meant to have these characters. Again, I also think because of that, these characters will be important. But there's not much to say about Jevil in my opinion, because I'm really not a theory head when it comes to Jevil. I have very specific interests in this game, and Jevil is simply not one of them. I like his design, I like his battle arena, I like a lot about Jevil, but he just does not interest me. I am more interested in yapping about the Field of Hopes and Dreams than I will probably ever be about talking about Jevil. Unless he shows up again in the game, does something incredibly cool, and he just walks off. He's cool. To talk about Jevil for a second, I also want to mention Sham. They're awesome. Whereas Jevil shows up, talks about stuff, and just is gone, Sham stays with you and explains the dark crystals. Sham will definitely have a role to play later in the game. Sham is insane. I love them. Also, I also think the theory I mentioned earlier about there being different generations of the Light World Warriors, the Fun Gang, I do think Sham was in a previous generation of Delta Warriors, and they may have played the same role Rousey is playing. A lot of people draw comparisons between Rousey and Sham, but I do think they're different characters. I don't think they're the same person or whatever, but they do kind of fill a very similar role. They both look the same. It was very interesting, and I like Sham. I like Sham. They're cool. They seem to know a lot about the story, which is a trend with a few characters. The voice at the beginning of the game, Gaster, that we talked about, obviously knows what's gonna happen. They know that. He knows that. Like Gaster, he knows that. Sham seems to also know the exact shadow crystals that you're going to get and what you're gonna need. I will get into this later because I have to bring Sham up again, but Sham knows what's going on. Sham knows what you're gonna do, and it seems to just be brushed over a lot of the time, and it kinda messes with me. A lot of the interesting stuff in this game is said and done, and then everybody kinda ignores it, which is a bit weird, because we should really talk about how Sham knows who you're going to fight next, or that you're going to find the shadow crystal next time you're in a dark world. That's very interesting. Sham knows a lot. Anyways, I'm gonna move on from this section because I really genuinely don't have anything to say about these characters like too much. Sham is cool. This is actually like the last thing I'm recording, which is the Rousey part. I figured I should kind of talk about Rousey, even though I don't really want to because I don't like Rousey that much. Rousey comes off as someone who really hides something like very important, and that only gets more important as the game goes on. Like, Rousey is incredibly shady and only reveals information as the game goes on, only when it's convenient, only when people really press him for information, which bothers me. I understand this is a game and you can't say what happens, but at the same time, a character clearly having an idea of the events about to unfold is a little bit annoying. I don't really like Rousey. I prefer Lancer much more, and this is kind of the reason I want to talk about Rousey, is because I want to talk about Lancer and how they contrast incredibly well. Susie instantly becomes friends with Lancer because Lancer is just very straightforward and very obvious, and I did talk about this in the Field of Hopes and Dreams, but I do genuinely hope that later on in the game, Lancer will become a party member and will replace Rousey in some capacity. I really like Lancer. I think he's genuine, unlike Rousey, who keeps secrets, who is overall just very shady. I don't like Rousey. I don't like his design after chapter 1, like at the end of the Dark World. I don't like that design. I don't like the head is weird. It's like you have this like head like on top of his body, and it just doesn't make sense to me. I don't like Rousey that much. I don't like his design. I love his chapter 1 design with the hat and the black fur, or like you know, it's like shadowed over, whatever it is. You know, I love that design for Rousey. I do not love Rousey how he looks later on in the game, and that's me personally. That's just me. But I just don't like how he looks. Another thing about Rousey is I generally don't like him is because he's a bit of a pushover. He's just very nice, has like a few moments where he kind of stands up for himself, but like if I just don't like Rousey. So I'd much rather talk about why I like Lancer instead, because Lancer, like I said, is very straightforward. Lancer says everything how it is. He just wants to be evil like his daddy wants to be scary, but in reality, Lancer just a bouncy little pumpkin. He is very cute. He is a little ball of fluff, and I love him. And everybody else loves him, as they should. He instantly becomes friends with Susie. Well, after a while, but like when Lancer actually begins to like talk to Susie and stuff in around the middle part of chapter 1, the two of them becomes good friends. And then the rest of chapter 1 is just seeing how good of a friend like Lancer is with Susie, and a lot of chapter 1 is this relationship between Susie and Lancer, because Lancer is just himself. Rousey is not himself. Rousey is being nice, but being nice is not necessarily a form of personality. Being nice is kind of how you act someone before you get to really know them, and before you really get to know, before they get to know you. That's what, you know, being nice really is. And that's kind of what Rousey is like. You could also make the argument that Rousey isn't really a person. It's very clear that he doesn't have an understanding of concepts. But even then, this whole nice act feels incredibly put on. To me, at least. Because we know, even without the things Rousey learns as the game goes on, like he learns sarcasm and a few other things, it is very clear as we go through the game that this is not really who Rousey is. This very nice persona, that is not Rousey. And that kind of bothers me, because you spend the entirety of chapter 1 more or less with Rousey, who is really not someone who they claim they are. I do not believe Rousey is a very goody two-shoes fluffy boy. I do not think Rousey is evil, that should be mentioned, but I also do not believe Rousey is incredibly nice. I believe Rousey is doing this nice act because he has to, because he was told by somebody to do this. As we know, Rousey is the Prince of Dark, or he's the Prince of the Darkness. As we know, Rousey is the Prince of the Darkness, or the Dark Prince, which obviously means there should be a queen or a king before him. Obviously, this kind of makes you think, oh, there's someone else telling Rousey what to do. There's someone else kind of pulling the strings, and that's exactly what I think, is that Rousey was told to act this way, to talk about the prophecy, to entice Chris and Susie to go on this adventure, because he has to. Someone else made him. And this is where you can kind of call back to Gaster, you know, knowing everything and what's about to happen, and knowing the story, knowing the names, knowing the people. I do think to a certain extent you can make a very good argument that Gaster created Rousey to go on this adventure. I do not believe that Rousey is, like, you know, a new person. I believe Rousey has a personality, we just do not get to see it. I do not think Rousey is learning how to be a person. I think Rousey is becoming comfortable with showing Susie and Chris who he is. That is what I believe is happening. Because unlike Susie, who becomes very comfortable with the fun gang, pretty much by the end of chapter 1, like, Susie is more or less best friends with everyone else. Like, she's learned to trust at least Chris. Susie has learned to trust Chris because Chris saved her, like, and protected her in chapter 1. And obviously it's a lot easier to trust someone like Chris, who doesn't really talk, as opposed to someone who's putting on an act. But I do believe to a certain extent that Rousey is not evil. I do not think Rousey's evil or has necessarily any like bad meaning for the Fun Gang, but it is very obvious that Rousey knows about the soul, knows about certain meta things in the game like bullet patterns. I do not really understand how bullet patterns work in a meta sense, but Rousey obviously comments on the bullet patterns and how certain enemies have this different bullet patterns, and it is never brought up again. That kind of comment is never brought up again in the game. I do not think so, and that's weird. I think that's weird because a lot of stuff in Chapter 1 never gets brought up again. But that's also because I feel like some of it has a purpose to be brought on way later. But Rousey is probably at his worst in Chapter 1 because he expresses so much knowledge of how the game itself works, and it is never said again, almost never again. When we learn in Chapter 2, we learn how to act as everyone. Like, Susie gets her action, Rousey gets her action, but Rousey never tells us that they can act. It is always Chris. It is supposed to be Chris. Chris is the leader. They are the only ones who can make other people act. And then Susie is the one who actually attempts to act on her own and gets Rousey to do it. Rousey obviously knew this was possible, most likely knew it was possible, at least never told anyone. And that's kind of a problem. Chris being the only one able to act makes the game harder, makes everything more difficult. You could say this is simply a difference in, Toby Fox developing the game, but there was such a specific way that learning acts in Act 2 was handled, where Susie is the one to break that. Susie broke the rule. Susie is the rule breaker. But Rousey never attempted to tell them this was possible. He never brought this up. And that's kind of why I don't like Rousey, because if Rousey brought up things like these earlier, I would not have a problem with Rousey, because you see, one thing about Rousey is whenever he's actually being truthful to the characters, more or less, we learn more about him. We enjoy him as a character more than when he's just like, oh, you can't do that, Susie. Oh, you can't. We gotta be nice to everyone. That's not a person. That's not a person. That's not someone. That's not a person. That's someone who was told to be nice, to get these lighteners to work with them so they can reach a goal. I would not be surprised if in the later chapters of the game, we still have to get chapter 5, 6, and 7. 6, 7. But anyways, I would not be surprised if in the later chapters of the game, Rousey just kind of drops this persona, because we have kind of already began to see it in later chapters, but right now in chapter 1, it is just like you're not talking to a person, and I think that's kind of part of it. Rousey's a dark. Rousey is an object in the real world. He is not a person, unfortunately. I see most of the characters in this game as my friends, but that mostly goes for the characters of the light world. I do not like Rousey, possibly because he's not a person, and that kind of also plays into this idea that, Rousey doesn't know how to act like a person, but at the same time, it is very clear that there is something under this nice demeanor, and it just messes me up, and I don't know what to talk about with Rousey, because Rousey kind of pisses me off, but not in an evil way, not in a way where I don't like the character. I appreciate Rousey, but I just hope that we get like a moment where Rousey is dead ass, where Rousey just like says it how it is, and is genuinely just Rousey. It is not this nice persona, because being nice is not a personality. Being nice is just being nice. It is something put on for appearances. You can be nice to your friends, but that is a character trait. If you are a nice person, that is simply a part of your character. Rousey does not have a lot of character in chapter 1 besides being nice. Susie is all over the place. She has a lot of character. She expresses a lot of character. Lancer expresses a lot of character. The two of them. That's why I like Lancer so much. Lancer is able to instantly become friends with Susie after a few conversations. Susie does not like Rousey, not because Rousey is trying to get her to not fight people, but because Rousey is more or less a pushover who just... because he... I don't know what to... talking about Rousey upsets me so much. It not upsets me, maybe. It's just like, I do not like Rousey. I'd like to talk about him a little later on in the other chapters. There will be more stuff to say, but chapter 1 Rousey, it is not someone I really like to talk about. It is someone who really just... And another thing about chapter 1 Rousey is when you're in the prison and you go to look at Susie, Chris and Rousey have a conversation without you being present. It is very obvious. Rousey understands who you are as the soul. It is brought up multiple times in the game that Rousey very obviously knows that you are the soul or that there is someone else. We never get an explanation for this. What is Rousey doing? Because I do not like this shady stuff that is happening. A lot of people like Rousey. I like Rousey, like, to an extent. I say I don't like him. Like, yeah, I don't like him, but I also don't hate him. Like, he's fine. I don't like him as much as the other characters. Rousey would rank very low on my list of Deltarune characters that I actually like. And like I said, the top of that character list is mostly the teenagers. And then you have, you know, Spamton, you have Lancer. The Darkners are very secondary in the characters that I like because, again, the Darkners are a little bit of a caricature. They are characters, they are people, some of them more than others. That's also like a thing. Certain characters in Deltarune have more characterization than others and are actually allowed to have more character than others. So a character that you see in chapter 2 like Spamton, there is a lot to Spamton, and there is a reason people like Spamton is because he has a lot going on. There is a lot going on with that character that is still relevant chapters on. Everybody loves Spamton, not because of his design necessarily, but because what he means to the story. But I really want to talk about um Spamton in his own little section, but just comparing them, I think Rousey just... I don't like Rousey. I don't want to talk about Rousey, but I had to talk about them because it's important to mention Rousey because of how important he is later on. And I kind of want to have this base that I talked about Rousey and I know what I feel like about him, and everyone else watching this knows what I feel about him. And then I can go to chapter 2 and talk about chapter 2 Rousey, which I like a fair bit more than chapter 1 Rousey. Not by a lot, because his design is obviously different in all the other chapters, but by a little bit, I do kind of like chapter 2 Rousey a bit more, like a little bit. Anyways, this is the Rousey section. I just want to move on. Now that we kind of talked about everybody, I do want to also talk about Susie and a few other things before I kind of finish this. One of the most important things is that, like, Susie is more or less a main character in her own right. We might not play as Susie, at least not yet, but she is pretty much the main person getting developed throughout the game, throughout chapter 1 especially. Just like Chris, Susie has a lot to say about herself in the way she acts. It's just that it's a lot easier for us to see how she acts because we're not controlling her and she's actually able to speak and have conversations. Susie is very clearly someone who has like a persona on. She tries to be scary and threatening, but in reality she just needs someone that she can trust. Throughout most of chapter 1, she's very standoffish and she pretends to not really care about things until she meets Lancer. And Lancer is really important to Susie, and Susie's very important to Lancer because they're genuine friends. When Lancer and Susie meet, it's probably one of the coolest moments in the game because Susie finally meets someone who's very genuine about themselves. I mean, it does take a while, but eventually Susie and Lancer become friends because Lancer is just very straightforward about who he is and what he wants. And he very obviously looks up to Susie for being able to be what he wants to be, which is like a scary, intimidating person. And Susie, in the same way, likes Lancer because he's genuine. There's nothing for her to fear when it's very obvious that Lancer is just very straightforward about what he wants. And it's very easy to her to just trust him and just be friends. She doesn't have to pretend to be a big scary monster around Lancer. She can just be herself, and it's very sweet to see. Unlike a few other characters, Susie doesn't really interact the same way she does to Lancer, besides like Chris after the events of like chapter 1, because she finally learns that she can trust Chris and Rousey. And it pretty much shows us that Susie's whole character that we met at the start and throughout the chapter was her just kind of putting on an act to be scary, because very obviously she doesn't know who to trust. She probably doesn't have a lot of people in her life that she can trust. Everybody probably knows someone who is very similar to Susie. She's, like I said, very rude to people until she actually learns to trust them, and you can't really fault Susie for that. It's really not her fault for the way that she protects herself, but we also realize that she's an incredibly nice person when she finds people she can depend on. There's also another important thing that I mentioned, which is the fact that Susie is more or less the main character in chapter 1, and it's kind of the same story for the rest of the chapters. Meanwhile, Chris, us, we kind of blend into the background. I don't think that's a bad thing, because for an example, the reason I don't really think that's a bad thing is because, for example, you have The Witcher 3, which is a great game, but in The Witcher 3, you're playing as Geralt. And in a lot of these games, if you're playing a character, you kind of make the conclusion that that character is probably not gonna die, right? Like they're not gonna die, they're probably gonna be fine. Maybe there's multiple choice endings where maybe they die. But regardless, you play as Geralt, and you have to find Ciri. And throughout the game, you get to see flashbacks of Ciri, you meet people that she's interacted with, and you kind of get an idea of her. You almost become attached to someone you haven't even met yet, which I think is really cool. And then you finally meet her, you rescue Ciri, and the ending of the game actually has decisions. The endings of the game, whichever one you end up getting based on your decisions throughout the game, will mostly impact Ciri. And in the same way that I cared about Ciri, even though I didn't play as her, I care about Susie, because in reality, Susie is as much of our character as Chris is. We still control her in battle, we just don't control her in the dark world and what she does and what she acts like, which is fine. This is really cool to me because it's almost like we're viewing Susie from a second-person perspective. We're meant to be Chris and see the world through Chris's eyes. So we see Susie through Chris's eyes. It's almost like we are there and we see everything that happens as someone who is actually present, not just a third spectator. While in reality, yes, we are a third spectator, to the characters, we are there. And as little as we can actually interact with them, as in dialogues, we are there and we can actually interact with them, which I think is really cool, because it's like, you don't see this kind of thing done often, and it can feel very weird if you're coming into Deltarune and being like, why is my main character not doing anything? Why am I not doing anything? Why is all the development going to all these other characters? And I think that's done to make us care, because I love Susie. I love all the characters in Deltarune. Like, I love Noelle, I love Rousey, I love Chris, Susie, Birdly. Okay, I said I love Rousey, but I don't really love Rousey that much, but whatever, you know. But I really like this because the game uses Chris as a way for all the other characters to develop, and you see that, and it's like you're right there with them. And yeah, I mean, Chris is put to the side a lot of the time, but I also think that kind of plays into Chris's character, as I mentioned. Like, everything in this game somewhat feels deliberate. Like, it feels in its own way to tell a story, and I like that about it. But Susie is pretty much the storyteller of the game. She is the main thing that usually drives the plot forward. You could say, you know, the Dark Worlds showing up is making the plot go forward, but Susie is the one person that's like making things happen, and it's really interesting. A lot of people have kind of theorized that Susie will eventually be a playable character in the later chapters. However, I really don't know how that would go. I think it would be cool if we take control of Susie and Susie doesn't actually give us full control and we have to argue with her and we have to come to terms that she's not going to give us full control, but she also has to come to terms with the fact that we're trying to help her. I think that could be a really cool idea for the later chapters where, oh, we have to team up with Susie, because we kind of see this a little bit done in chapter 1 when Susie fights Lancer, but again, it's not really done to that extent because all that the soul is used for in that part is to just dodge bullet patterns. In general, I think Susie is like pretty goated. She's pretty awesome. Definitely like one of my favorite characters from the game. Not my favorite, but like if you had a rating of characters, it's gonna be number 1. Then there's gonna be number 2, which is Chris. Then there's gonna be number 3, which is Susie. Then there's Noelle, and then there's everyone else under Noelle. Number 1 I haven't mentioned yet because we will have to wait to actually get to number 1, but that's my ranking. Chris, Susie, and Noelle are pretty much the most important characters to me in this game, and I love them. I love them. They're amazing. And there's kind of one thing that they all have going on for them is that they're a bunch of weird kids, and I was a weird kid, and I really relate to them, and I love them all. And they're my little babies. I love them. I love these kids so much. I love them. A few more things to say about Susie. I really like her design. I think it's pretty cool, especially the light world design. The dark world design is like whatever. My favorite dark world design is definitely Chapter 1 Rousey, without doubt, but without Chapter 1 Rousey, it's definitely Chris, and then after Chris, it's Susie. But I really can't say much about Susie because it feels very, I don't know, ordinary, I suppose. Like the bruiser type character, if that makes sense. It feels very normal. It feels very like standard for a character like her, which is fine. But her light world design, I am obsessed with. There's something about it that I just really fuck with, and I just think it's cool. I really mess with it. I think it's awesome. I think she looks badass. Like, she's cool. She's Susie Deltarune. Susie Deltarune. Like, she's cool. And Chris also looks cool in the light world, but I mean, the whole thing with Chris is like they wear the Chara sweater or whatever it's called, and it's like supposed to be a callback. I don't think we'll get the, customization options anytime soon in the game, but that would be cool, Toby Fox. I suppose you do kind of change outfits in chapter 4, but that's like a very short amount of time, and you know, that is kind of like a cool idea, I guess, but yeah, it's whatever. Anything else about Susie? I don't think I have so much to say in chapter 1, besides the fact that like she's awesome, and I love her friendship with Lancer. They're so cute together, and it persists throughout the rest of the game. I genuinely think like Susie and Lancer may actually become playable characters like later in the game, as in we play as Susie and Lancer joins our party when something inevitably happens to Chris or Rousey. Lancer will definitely join our party, and I think that's gonna be cool to see. It's gonna be interesting to see as well how that's done, but I would really be up for the idea that Lancer joins the party and fills the Rousey lore of Darkener Prince, because Lancer is a Darkener Prince, and it would make sense for him to be the prince from the prophecy. But should probably hold on to that later because there's a whole lot of discussion you can make about the prophecy and how the roles in the prophecy are actually not the correct ones to the people present. But that will be probably for later. There's also a very specific thing I wanted to talk about. When you get out of the dark world at the end of the chapter, the way the school looks and the sound, like the ambient sound, it is so nice. I cannot actually like explain what I mean by this. It's just that it has such a vibe to it. Like if you remember a kid, like being a kid, and like whenever I would leave school, it would be like, you know, a nice shade of like gold, brown, like sun. Like I don't know what I'm talking about. Like I'm trying to explain that. Like when I was a kid, you know, stay later like after school to do like other stuff, and when you get out, it's all like afternoon sunset, and it is such a vibe. It was such a vibe, and the moment I stepped out of that dark world with Chris and Susie, it felt like I kind of got some flashbacks. I kind of got some memories, and it's like that's what I like about this game, is that a lot of it can kind of make you remember stuff of when you were the same age as these characters or even younger. And that's what I really love about it. This game really makes you think. Like, it really makes you feel stuff. It is not just there to exist. Stuff in this game doesn't just exist. And the best comparison I can kind of make to this is Silent Hill 2 specifically, because I only played Silent Hill 2 and 3. There's something I really like about Silent Hill 2. In Silent Hill 2, every room in that game, every area has a purpose. There is no room that is just a room that is like empty and you do nothing. You will find something in that room, you will do something, you will unlock a door, you'll find a weapon, and it is very big contrast, you know, Deltarune and Silent Hill 2, but I have to talk about this. In Deltarune, almost everything kind of has a purpose. And this exact thing, talking about like the school having a very nice feel, like a nostalgic vibe to it, is exactly what I mean. Because we never really get this later. I mean, sure, in chapter 2, you can finish the Dark World and then go back into the school, but I do not actually remember if it looks like sundown, like sunset kind of thing to it. I don't know. I'm pretty sure like in chapter 2, like you leave school like early. Like I'm pretty sure in chapter 1 you actually stay at school like longer than like any other chapters. But I do think, you know, like it shows a passage of time, but it also shows that like you're back into the normal world, and it's kind of tranquil, and it's like everything that happened in the Dark World stays in the Dark World. Now we're in the Light World, and it's just peaceful hometown, which I have kind of a feeling that this, alongside a lot of other things in later chapters, kind of foreshadows that, you know, something's gonna happen. Stranger Things season 5 just kind of ended, and this is really funny to bring up, but like imagine the idea that the Dark Worlds and the Light Worlds get connected, because that was the idea in Stranger Things, and I kind of, you know, that's very seeable. Like you can kind of see that happening in like a future Dark World. There is some theories about chapter 5 actually doing that, because we hear about, you know, the festival happening soon, and that's actually something I think we hear from chapter 1, or it may start from chapter 2 onwards, but that's also really interesting, this festival. But I have to get into that in chapter 2, so I'm not going to talk about that right now. I'm trying to just talk about chapter 1, and it is so hard at times to talk about chapter 1 because there's very little to sort of go into. That's why I really like talking about these very specific things. I try talking about the characters, but again, it is sometimes very hard in chapter 1 specifically to come up with things to say, because you can speak about Susie, but everybody's kind of spoken about Susie, and we've heard everything about Susie. I still want to talk about Susie because she is the little lesbian that has captured the hearts of many, and I love Susie, but there's a lot of other stuff to talk about. While I'm here kind of talking about the Light World, I do appreciate this little thing. As we see in the future, almost every chapter has an end section after you finish dealing with the Dark World, where you can explore it to your enjoyment. Now, the timing of this may be different, whether it's before you go into the Dark World or after, but regardless, almost every chapter has a period of time or a section, because you're not timed. You can stay in the Light World in a hometown as long as you want. But every chapter does have this specific point where, like this specific section, you can go around, talk to people, and events do change. There is a significant amount of stuff that you can do in the Light World that will affect future Light World, like, adventures. There is characters you can talk to that if you never talk to them, they will never be brought up again. Specifically, this onion thing in the water, if you do not talk to them right now, I'm pretty sure they do not show up later. There seems to be a specific storyline tied to this character, and as we go through the game, there will be multiple scenes regarding this area over here. A lot of people kind of speculate something to be in the water, something connected to a Dark World. Now, I do not particularly think this, because while this is something you can miss, that's kind of my biggest thing. You can miss this. Do I think this will be relevant later on? I'm not sure. I do think this character, it will be fairly relevant, but, you know, as to the fact that they'll be important to the story, maybe not. I feel like this could just be a little bit of a gag. like the whole wanting to show you something in the water or whatever is could end up being a gag, but I will bring this up in future episodes because I kind of want to have this trail line of actually following this. You can also go around town and just talk to people and learn about Chris, about Susie, and sort of like the situation with like all the families and stuff. I mean, you can go into the hospital and you can meet Noelle and Rudy. Noelle is one of my favorite characters in this game. I cannot talk to her about now because I have to wait until the chapter 2 video because there's so much to say about Noelle. But if I say it now, it's just gonna be, oh, this happens in chapter 2, so I gotta wait for that. Rudy, on the other hand, we can talk about him because there is a lot of interesting stuff about Rudy. Rudy, on the other hand, we can actually talk about. He is a very interesting character because he is a sickly person in, like, the game. And that might not mean a lot, but, like, Deltarune is, like, sort of a fun game, and it's dealing with something, like, pretty deep. I mean, a lot of people, like, including me, have had, like, a relative in the hospital. Now, we don't really know what's wrong with Rudy, but Noelle seems pretty scared when Rudy makes a joke and stuff like that. He still seems to keep his general mood of like an uncle type figure, sort of, because him and Asgore, like the two families, you know, the Holidays and the Dreamers, they're incredibly close. Or used to be, which is another thing. They used to be close. Something happened. They're not close anymore. Now this could just be them growing up, but there's a lot of reasons to suspect that something happened between the two families, or someone happened to go missing, but that's kind of like something more important for later. I love Noelle. She's spending time with her dad, just trying to cheer him up. I kind of like Rudy, but at the same time, I don't like him because he kind of reminds me of like the type of person he is. Rudy makes kind of Rudy makes fun of Chris for being a weird, creepy kid. I get that it's like a joke, but I think we've all had this kind of a relative or distant relative or friend or whatever, like person in our life who's like, ah, you're a weird kid. Oh, you're quiet. You don't speak much. You know, like saying like stuff like that, it's not really nice, especially when you kind of say it to a kid. I understand that Rudy doesn't mean anything rude by what he says. However, at the same time, this kind of tells us more about Chris, like I mentioned before. I mean, weird, creepy kid. Yeah, that's enough of calling Chris a weird, creepy kid is enough for me to be like, yeah, I know exactly the type of kid Chris was before this happened, before we took control of them. I don't need to know more. Chris is just like me when I was their age, and I'm kinda still like that at 21, just a weird, awkward kid. Well, I'm not a kid anymore, I'm like a legal adult, which is incredibly terrible and painful, but you know, you can kind of see, there's a lot of dialogues like this, like I mentioned before in the Chris section. There's a lot of dialogues like this throughout the game that just kind of makes fun of Chris. There's a few others that also make fun of Susie, calling Susie a weirdo and stuff. I mean, we have two very different characters here. We're dealing with Chris, who's just a weird, awkward kid, and we're also dealing with Susie, who is afraid to actually open up to people. And everyone, like, kind of makes fun of that, which is very weird to me. It's kind of sad. This game deals with, like, a lot of the characters in this game are just kids that are treated very poorly by their parents, and I wish I could, like, just hug them. Like, I love Chris, I love Susie, I love Noelle, and I love Birdly. As much as other people don't like Birdly, that I think they all have to be protected, and I love them with all my heart. And that's kind of why I love them with all my heart. And I kind of have a problem with everyone talking like that about them. I kind of have a problem because even other kids their age actively talk like that, which you can kind of take as bullying. Chris and Susie especially do not have an easy time in hometown. Birdly kind of goes by, he at least gets by sort of being smart, and Noelle is part of a very important family in hometown. But Chris and Susie, I mean, we don't ever learn about Susie's parents. So far, we could get parents, we could get a parent reveal. I'm very afraid that Susie doesn't actually have a parent. I do think Toby might introduce like a caretaker for Susie. I'm not sure, to be fair. I don't know if that will happen, to introduce a whole new character in Chapter 5 that is so important to Susie, and she's never mentioned them before. It's either abusive parents, which most of the characters in this game seem to have, because abuse is not only physical, or just she lives by herself. She could be possibly homeless, but there is theories in the game to suggest that she isn't homeless, so that's great. I'm very afraid for Susie because besides Chris, who is essentially us, so like we control Chris, besides them, Susie has nobody. And this might not be important now, but as the game goes on, we see the stakes get higher. In Chapter 1, we are not introduced to anyone who looks after Susie. And I might mention this again, but I will say right now, we are never introduced to anybody who looks after Susie. Like I said, if something were to happen to Susie and Chris in the light world, who would help them? Rousey is not there, and they do not have weapons. That is something I fear. In Chapter 1, perhaps not, because nothing's really happened in Chapter 1 besides the Dark World adventures. But as the game continues, it kind of becomes a little more scary, and I start to care a lot for these kids. And that's kind of something this game does very well, and Undertale did it as well. It makes you care a lot for its characters, and you don't really see them as characters, you kind of see them as people. Maybe other people don't. I do. I'm 21. I'm kind of young in the grand scheme of things, you know? Toby Fox makes you care for characters, and it makes you care for settings in the same way that I find the classrooms during the sunset very nostalgic. I see myself in the characters, and I can't help but care about them. Some people call it parasocial, and I'm pretty sure that's like a correct way to say it, right? But what I mean by that is they kind of say it in a mean way, like, ah, you're parasocial. I think it's kind of fine to be parasocial with some things. Characters, like fictional characters, like, if you want to pretend you're friends with someone, or if you want to pretend you're friends with Chris and Susie and you're like an older sister to them who looks after them and keeps them safe, that is my self-insert, by the way. I am the older sister who keeps them safe. That's fine. I think parasocial stuff takes a line when you're talking about actual people, mostly YouTubers and streamers and celebrities. If a real person doesn't know you, they don't know you. You cannot really think in your head, oh, they're my friend. A fictional character, on the other hand, if you want to, you can get attached to them, because at the end of the day, what else are you gonna get attached to, you know? Care for characters. I think that is very important. Care for a character and just enjoy, write your stories, draw your fan art, include your self-insert. It is fine. I think it is what Toby Fox would want us to do, is to see these characters as people and just, you know, take what we want from these stories. I may not like everything in Deltarune, but even if the chapters become terrible, even if the combat becomes very lacking, I will always come back just because of Susie and Chris. And the other characters, yes, but mainly these two. They're very important. There is another very important character. I cannot talk about her yet, but she's probably the most important character in this game to me. Anyways, I want to talk about the next thing now, because I've kind of spent a lot of time on this, and I'm not really strapped for time or anything, but like, I kind of want to move on to the next thing. Okay, so I talked about almost everything that I really find interesting. If not, I will mention it in other videos. I kinda just want to make videos talking about games I like, and I'm gonna start with Deltarune, but I will talk about other games. This is not necessarily just a Deltarune channel. I kinda just want to talk about stuff that I really find interesting, and I hope I can keep improving the way I make YouTube and videos and stuff. Because I was like, why not? Let me make YouTube videos. So now I'm trying that. I'll have a Discord linked in the description, and if anyone would like to join, they're welcome. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, it's really cool.